Way.
Okay, so now we are recording. So I'm really glad that we get a chance to talk about this because anybody who knows me or has ever seen me work knows that I always say SIPS is the world I live in. This is what I do when I've got someone on the table. And so Ian Stubbings, being the creator of the SIPS program and being one of my mentors, I'm really happy that we're getting a chance to talk tonight. So I'm just going to launch into these questions here.
Sure.
The first thing that I wanted to talk about was, again, on this theme of tiny worlds and microbiomes. Most people think of microbiomes as just relating to intestinal flora. And so I'm wondering what led you to take a look at this close-up blood tissue that we see in the level of SIPS bio.
Okay, well, I mean, firstly, if we sort of look at the subject of microbiomes themselves, as you mentioned, they're much more than just the gut flora. And in actual fact, the microbiomes includes, yes, bacteria in all sorts of places in our body, yeasts, fungi and viruses. But the research at the moment has been particularly focusing on the gut flora or bacteria and discovering all sorts of amazing things, which is fantastic. But the microbiomes as a family are found, well, on or in our skin, in our mouth, stomach, small intestine, large intestine, digestive system, but also our reproductive organs and no doubt other places in our body. So the main area of research in microbiomes now is really just a small part of sort of research into this one large subject, but at least it is revealing, properties about these microbes in our body and essentially how important they are to us. So but coming back to your question, I came to this subject of microbiomes only because of a discussion I was having with my sister-in-law, Margot. We were having a chat about Royal Rife and his great microscope and these things. And she then said to me, well, look, I just want you to look up this one word and see where it leads you. And the word was somatid. And that led me sort of on a pathway to look that word up and discover the great work of a French gentleman, Gaston Naessens, and discovered an amazing story about these tiny little crystalline things that are, he observed in our blood and were described as like dancing little particles that were virtually the size of a virus or even less in size. So they're like nanocrystals that are darting and dancing around in our blood. So that was, his story was quite fascinating. Unfortunately, there's not much literature around on this subject, but I managed to find, some interesting information. And he basically, he was a biologist and engineer that he was born in 1924, and ultimately he did his studies sort of through the war period, and shortly after the war he went to work in a blood laboratory, and through a normal conventional light microscope basically gleaned some tiny particles that everybody else thought was waste matter. He thought maybe it had some more importance than just waste, but his main problem was that he couldn't see these particles properly enough to understand anything more about them. That led him to go to Germany and learn all he could about optics, and he built a fantastic microscope called a somatoscope, which is these days called a dark field microscope. And through this he could observe these tiny particles at some 30,000 times magnification with great clarity whilst the blood was still alive. And that's the critical thing, because when we look at blood, it needs to be under a normal light microscope. It's normally stained, and the staining process dehydrates and kills the blood cells, and therefore kills anything in the fluid, our blood fluid. And also at the same time, if you look at anything under an electron microscope, then it's radiated and dehydrated and therefore inert. So his microscope was really a revolution in the microscopic field, and allowed him to see actual living organisms very clearly. So he studied these particles and amazingly found that they were basically in all the fluids in our body, in our blood, our plasma, in our interstitial fluid, actually inside our cells, in all these places. And he observed that when spending hours through his microscope looking at these things, that they changed form. And that was an absolute, a great discovery, in a sense that we're stuck with the dogma of monomorphism, or things not changing form. And he observed that these things changed form before his very eyes. And they changed form into things like bacteria and so on, went through a particular stages in life cycle. So this was his research. I found very fascinating. Once you get your sort of your mind and head into this subject, it changes your whole view on the basis of, how can I put it, life even, or these kind of microbes within our body and within our being. And then you start wondering, well, where do they come from? What are they there for, and what are they doing? And it's an absolutely fascinating subject. So it was only through my sort of research into the somatids and understanding their processes that well, I better describe. Well, basically, of course, Gaston Neeson's observed that these tiny crystals that were like nanoparticles in our blood had a healthy stage of 3 stages, and they changed from this tiny crystal into a membrane-bound spore and double spores and so on. And there were then these stages that when the environment in our body and our fluids changed, that they could then change into what looked like bacteria and what looked like yeast, and then what looked like molds and fungi and so on, and actually completed the cycle by releasing more tiny crystals or somatids into our fluids in the body. So once I learned a lot more about these microbes and microorganisms in our body, then ultimately, of course, towards the end of preparing this material, I thought it was important to then have a look at and understand the nature of, our gut bacteria, and try and understand more about where they might have come from, what they're doing there, and, are they beneficial or are they harmful to us? Just to get a better understanding of all those aspects. So basically, once I realised that we had bugs in our body, I thought, well, let's look at as many as we can find and try and understand it and see if we can work with them, see if we can balance them. So that was my main motivation into looking at the subject of microbiomes. I was led to it from researching the subject of somatids. Mm-hmm.
Right. So then, is there a symbiotic relationship between the somatids and our cells? So do they require in order to be? And how does that all work then?
Okay. Well, most people nowadays have an awareness of microbiomes because when I sort of started getting into this subject, there was about sort of 10 years of research that had been accumulated and being conducted, but there weren't that many sort of books being published at that stage. There have been many since in the last few years, But there were sort of publications on the internet of research that I could then sort of glean what they discovered. And when I looked into this, then clearly what they discovered was amazing, that, you know, the bacteria in our gut were absolutely essential basically for our life or life processes. Firstly, from a digestive point of view, they're absolutely essential for helping break down foodstuffs that our body hasn't got the ability to break down. So they release all sorts of digestive enzymes to help break down, you know, the food products and carbohydrates and sort of foodstuffs and fruits and just apples and oranges and these sorts of things. Otherwise, if they weren't there, we wouldn't be able to absorb the nutrients from these, and we would be nutrient deficient. So they're very helpful from that point of view, but they discovered absolutely critically that some of the bacteria produce protein factors that stimulates our immune system to produce regulatory T cells, or innate lymphoid cells they're called. But these are T cells that regulate our immune system and stop it from becoming overactive or, you know, underactive. And in a sense, what they do is signal to our immune system to say, hey, it's okay for these symbiotic bugs to exist in our intestines and help us with all these digestive processes. So ultimately, they claim that basically the microbiomes in our gut are responsible for something like 60% of the effectiveness or power of our immune system. And in this regards, from a digestive point of view and immune system point of view, clearly they're vital to our life processes and therefore us clearly symbiotic. So in that sense, absolutely, they say we would not be here without the bacteria in our gut. But of course, like any kind of bacteria, when something gets out of balance, what is symbiotic and helpful at one stage, when it's out of balance and can overgrow, for example, can become inflammatory or pathogenic, you know, when it is out of balance. So, yes, certainly the microbiomes are clearly, they've discovered a symbiotic, but also on the other hand, when we look at somatids, they also appear to have a clearly symbiotic relationship with our body, our cells, and our life processes. And in actual fact, this is where Gaston Neeson's discovered that there's a healthy, 3 stages of 16 stages in their life cycle that are absolutely essential for our life processes and our being. For example, he discovered that these somatids, these tiny crystals that turn into spores, release growth factors that are responsible for cell division. So he's saying without the growth factors from the somatids, there would be no cell division. So with no cell division, there is no us. So yes, absolutely, somatids and the healthy stages of their cycle are absolutely symbiotic and essential for our life also. But in the same vein, these somatids, when the environment becomes polluted and acid and toxic and oxidized, then clearly these somatids actually respond and adapt to their environment and become change form into like bacterial forms through a stages of bacteria, and then ultimately the bacteria release yeast spores that then evolve into other types of yeast and forms that then evolve into releasing fungal forms. They call it in a mycelial form, and can create all sorts of different types of fungi. So these are very pathogenic stages and are present relative to pretty much all degenerative diseases that they've looked at and observed relative to viewing the people's blood that have degenerative diseases. So yes, they're very symbiotic, but on the other hand, when they're out of balance, they can become very harmful or pathogenic. So our goal is to try and remain in the balanced symbiotic stages and states. So I think, I don't know, that's, hopefully I think that would help explain that. As I said, yeah, it's been said we would not exist without the somatid, and Beauchamp, Antoine Beauchamp, who's a gentleman way back in time that sort of was the first to really realise the existence of these tiny microbes and crystals, and he actually was studying the process of fermentation for sugars and alcohols and these things, and he discovered that they were actually little fermenters, that they help break things down in there, but that's more so in their latter stages or the pathogenic stages. And because of this, they acted a bit like enzymes. He called them microzymers. And he basically said that they're the living agents of all organisation, and they're also the living agents of disease and death. And ultimately, he basically said that the somatids are the basic unit of life, in that they can reproduce, they exist, they reproduce, they have a life cycle, and essentially they're present in the ova at the beginning of life, and they are actually the agents of, ultimately, of our death and breaking it down when we die. So yes, they're an absolute part of nature, and they're a part of us. So yeah, anyway, that's sort of, you know, this relationship of microbiomes and somatids and the fact that these tiny organisms absolutely are symbiotic and balance in healthy stages, but can become destructive when out of balance.
Well, it sounds
so
like that's basically a two-way street, right? It's like when they're out of balance, they start creating health problems for the host, for us, but by the same token, us being out of balance, that's creating that form, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's
yes, certainly.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. So essentially, what Antoine Beauchamp found was that when, if you like, our internal environment, or they described as the internal milieu, was out of balance, then ultimately it led, you know, these somatids or microzymers to change form, in a sense, basically to look to clean up their environment. That was their role. So if we allow our body, you know, the fluids in our body, if you like, you can call it our internal ocean, to become more like a swamp, then we are essentially responsible for providing the environment for these little organisms to change form, to look to clean the swamp up. Mm-hmm. And ultimately, you know, it can happen as a whole body. If our whole body is like a swamp, well, then they will be very active, and we will be very diseased or having ill health issues. On the other hand, if we have a part of our body that is the weakest link, these are the parts that are likely to be most acid or oxidized or polluted, then certainly the microzymers can change form and become active in parts of our body. So they can also relate to inflammation and conditions of disease in parts of the body, apart from just throughout our blood or vascular system. So it's, it's a fascinating subject, and they can act in a rather whole body manner, or they can have a focal sort of, they can affect parts of our body. So, but, I think one of the interesting things to talk about, and we're probably going to come to it shortly, is sort of the history of science and medicine, and the course of events as to why we're only just now sort of recognising some of these microbes in our body. I'm not sure. Is that somewhere where you'd like to head?
We can totally talk about that. So by that you're meaning, the idea of germ theory taking over, and that's
exactly
what all of allopathic medicine is sort of focused on henceforth.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, sure. Let's hear it.
Okay. One of the most profound things that hit me when looking into this research is that essentially, these tiny dancing particles in our blood or in our other fluids, so a particular handful of scientists have been aware of these for over 150 years. And as I said, Antoine Beauchamp was really the first one through a brilliant series of research and processes into fermentation and other aspects, just really deduced the progressive stages and life cycle, if you're not the whole life cycle, but the existence of these microzymas and the fact that they did change form. And he understood clearly that one moment they're tiny little particles that he could barely see through his old light microscope, to observing that through a fermentation process that they were turning into like bacterial forms or fungal forms or yeast forms. And therefore that the theory that was put forward by the Louis Pasteur and the likes, that was about, once a cell is formed in our body, it will never change form, and things never change form in our body, called monomorphism, was clearly not correct. That we have these dancing little particles in us, for starters, that depending on their environment can absolutely change form, that he observed happening. And Gaston Neeson's, when he came along years later in his great microscope, observed these stages and videoed these stages, and it was clearly and absolutely observable. And the likes of other researchers like Gunther Enderlein and these people observed the same thing. So clearly, the dogma and the paradigms that we have in medicine and biology are clearly wrong, and therefore, the principles of monomorphism are wrong for starters, and therefore then secondly, it's like, well, we've got to ask, the other major theory at the time was germ theory, where we catch all our germs. In other words, where we become infected with these microbes from outside our body, and somehow we're infected by them. Look, it can happen. I'm not saying it doesn't happen. But what they totally missed is the fact that we can generate and create our own forms of microbes within our body. And we do this more so than the ones that we actually catch. So, and that the ones that we allow to generate and create in our own body when we have swampy conditions, if you like, are the ones that are basically totally responsible for our degenerative diseases, but all forms of degenerative diseases. So it just seemed that, this defining moment, or the course of history of medicine and science that happened, 150 years ago, was just such a great shame. But basically, unfortunately, it was this course of history was followed because essentially of one gentleman and his friends, and that was Louis Pasteur. And unfortunately, he was a gentleman that plagiarized Antoine Beauchamp's discoveries like crazy, but he never understood, the meaning behind his discoveries. And for example, Louis Pasteur is held up as, how can I put it, the person that discovered antisepsis or sterilizing things. But he didn't discover it. Antoine Beauchamp did. And Louis Pasteur never understood it properly in the first instance. And ultimately, here we are, we've got our milk bottles being with pasteurization on them, and it was a fraud. That's all I'm sorry to offend all those people that are, in science and medicine, but basically there's testament to this plagiarizing, and the gentleman that should be admired for his research is Antoine Beauchamp, and ultimately, if he was a more outgoing or extroverted person, not as humble as he was, well then maybe we would have an entirely different system of health, an entirely different medical system, of instead of looking for drugs to kill cancer or a specific drug to deal with an infection, then we might be actually looking at medicines to boost our immune system for the body to do what it's meant to do naturally, and we might be actually looking at an understanding that all the basic fundamental things about keeping the ocean in our body clean so that we stay in the healthy stages for not only, the somatids, but also the microbiomes and all these different forms of microbes in our body. Basically, every textbook that's been written in biology and medicine is, the first chapters are totally wrong. And if we had had the opportunity back then to put the billions of dollars into research in this field, well then clearly we would be in a much better place. But that's, something that is, the course of history is the course of history. We are where we are, and we have, the health industry as it is now is a huge industry it's a big factor in the economy, and therefore if you're looking for processes that might challenge that industry, well then we have a problem. And one of the other main problems is that, well, firstly, biology is meant to be about the study of life, but mostly people using microscopes in medicine these days are studying dead matter. So how can they even understand how these things function or change form in any case? And ultimately, where was I going? We're stuck in this sort of the dogma of monomorphism and germ theory. And yes, I remember now. Basically, what Gaston Neesens and his wife Francoise realised is that these tiny crystals in dancing particles are crystalline. So they're actually particles that react with energy. And so they can receive energy, they can, act like a piezoelectric effect, like the crystal in your watch. They can vibrate, they can store energy, and they can give off energy. So they're a means of, receiving energy and communicating with it and giving it off. And this energy, mostly, as we understand it, is electrical or electromagnetic energy. So for scientists today to understand this field, they need to have an understanding of physics and electrical engineering and not just be dedicated solely to biology. So ultimately, we'll only truly understand the interaction of these things and how they communicate and how they may possibly change form through understanding the fact that they are a particle of energy that actually changes form and becomes a membrane-bound kind of organism, as in a particle of biological matter. So the properties of it are absolutely astounding, but you don't find many biophysicists in medicine these days. So again, there needs to be another breakthrough, another turn in the course of research where there are people coming together from biology and electrical engineering and the physicists and physics to put their minds together to truly understand how our bodies function. I mean, we understand that better as kinesiologists because, you know, we work with these aspects of energy, and it's been our job to try and understand what this energy is and what impact it has on physical biological function. But basically, modern medicine is stuck with germ theory and monomorphism, and I'm hoping that firstly through them gleaning that microbes in our body, like the microbiomes in our gut, are truly beneficial and essential to life, that they also might start thinking about, well, firstly, the properties of these microbiomes, the relationship of them to our, you know, their genetic material, to our genetic material, and therefore, ultimately, that, yeah, we do have the communication systems between what we might think are foreign microbes and our own cells. But ultimately, once you delve into this fascinating world of somatids or microzymas, then clearly understand that these change form into things that look like bacteria, etc., that you've got to open your mind to the fact that maybe the bacteria in our gut is something that we have created and formed ourselves as a part of nature. And that, yes, if we allow the conditions in our gut to get out of balance, well, then, yes, they will get out of balance also. Just like, you know, the oceans and the fluids in our body. So, but the problem is that these handful of people that have dedicated their lives to this research, like Gaston Neeson's on microzymas and Beauchamp, these people have been subject to such ridicule that ultimately Gaston Neeson's never wanted to publish any papers on his research because he said it would not pass any peer review. In other words, he found that the peers were so stuck in their dogma and convention from Louis Pasteur's time about germ theory and monomorphism that they cannot countenance or even comprehend the possibility or existence of other life forms in our body that have generated from within. So ultimately, until you know, there are more people and scientists and people open enough and willing enough to recognise the existence of these things, then and only then maybe there will be little more funding dedicated to the research of these things. Because ultimately, you know, if there is not funding available for research, then our discovery or understanding of these things will be retarded or held back for years or centuries. And that will be to the detriment of the human race, unfortunately. But anyway, so that's my little rant about the injustice of some people in history and research. And I mean, the story of Royal Rife, people can look that up on the internet also. Another self-taught genius that, you know, created a fantastic system in radionics, etc. You know, also ridiculed and attacked and all the rest of it. So there are many people sort of through time that have come up with understandings and very simple healing processes that have been treated in a similar manner.
Well,
Okay.
you can kind of understand how this happens, because for people in our field, the idea that the body is dynamic and changing, and that things are a cycle that can be reversed, is very appealing, because that's what we do. But if you have made your living and spent all of your time studying basically the idea that if you have a bacteria, what you need is for me to give you an antibiotic that's going to kill it, and that's the only way that you're going to be okay, it's really hard to change that dogma, as you're saying, right? There's a lot invested in it. And when I say there's a lot invested in it, I mean even just in people's time and attention, not just in big pharma, right?
Sure. Yeah, because it's the bacteria that's always the enemy, right? And we've got to kill it. So, and that again is the main point about this subject, is that these people that study it, like Rife and Beauchamp and Nasons, are saying that bacteria is not the cause of the disease, that basically they are the result. They appear because we have allowed our ocean to become a swamp, and we've allowed our internals to degenerate to the point that actually then these bacterial forms ultimately present themselves to try and clean things up. But in the process, yes, if the swampy is that bad, they will clean up our whole body in that manner. That is their role.
Right.
So in that sense, trying to kill these bacteria, it may be one sort of immediate effective solution, but then these things are changing form, as we know, and they are changing form that are resistant to antibiotics. And one of the other interesting things that are discovered about the microbiomes in the gut is that they actually act as antibiotics, and they clean up the bad bacteria. They can sense and determine what is bad bacteria, and they'll clean it up themselves. And they are like 100 or 200 times more powerful than any antibiotic we can actually take. So we are far better off looking after our own natural antibiotics and keeping them healthy and active and happy and working to their potential than being dependent on taking antibiotics to then kill the bacteria. But unfortunately, antibiotics kill all the good symbiotic bacteria at the same time, and that then undercuts the foundations of our immune system. In other words, in that manner, they're actually destroying our immune system, which should be normally working away at trying to help protect us. So, yeah, it's very fascinating.
We've touched on it a little bit because you've mentioned the word, the ocean's becoming the swamp a few times. So I'm understanding that general toxicity and pollutants in the body are one of the things that cause some of the problems. So other than just doing massive detoxing or something like that, what do we do to keep the little guys happy so that they stay in those beneficial forms, as opposed to going into the more bacteria, yeasty kind of spills?
Look, I guess one of the other major things that struck me about investigating and researching somatids was that it totally reinforced the fundamentals about kind of good living habits. So basically good air, good water, good foods, good exercise, and, not too much stress. These kind of things, if we maintain these things, if we can, how can I put it, try and practice healthy lifestyle to begin with, well then certainly that will help our body not become acid. It will help it, not be too oxidized, or toxic or polluted, and essentially it will help keep the somatids in their symbiotic stages or cycles, where yes, that they are essential for like growth factors and healing and repair in these processes. Certainly. That was one of the things that stood out like crazy. But on the other hand, when I was looking at this subject, I'm thinking, well, look, are these somatids, are they a true part of us, or are they just like parasites? Mm-hmm. There's something that, yes, they exist everywhere in nature, in plants and in the soil, and wherever you look, there are these tiny little crystals. But it appears that, when they are a part of us, they become a part of us, they are specific to us. And Gaston Nason's even stated quite dramatically that he believes that they are precursors to our DNA. So that, in other words, they have some ability to have a regulatory role relative to our DNA, a creative role and a regulatory role relative to our DNA, and or communicate with it in a particular manner. And no doubt probably electrically, electromagnetically, through vibration, to decide, in a sense, have an influence on which genes are active or not active. So where was I going? So basically, the somatids themselves, I felt that they're a part of our being, and even Beauchamp said, yes, we have a family of them throughout our vascular system and through our interstitial fluids and so on. But he even went on to say that he felt that they were somatids that were specific to our liver or kidney or organs or parts of our body, so that they had their own specific frequency signature relative to these specialized parts of our body. So it would clearly seem that, they're like the concretization of energy. They contain, lots of energy, and they're the most energetic little particle in our body by far. But they also not only receive or transduce and transmit energy, but they also must transduce and transmit information. Where that comes from, don't ask me, but it's obvious that this process happens, and if as precursors of DNA, then they must contain some organisation and information to help organise our body and its life cycle. So, I'm just lost the first question, but essentially, so yes, I'm coming back now. I'm remembering. So when I came to this work, I thought, well, if they are a part of our body, can we communicate with them? Can we use a muscle test to get feedback? Can we talk to them to try and get feedback on, okay, how are you going? What state are you in? Are you in your balanced stages? Oh, no, sorry, this part of the body is not going so well. It's a bit acid or a bit polluted. No, I'm slipping into the sort of the pathogenic stages. And these so basically, firstly, I recognise, we can talk to them, we can get feedback from them, and therefore determine whether they're in balance in symbiotic stages or whether they've, crossed a barrier of our immune system and slipped into the pathogenic stages. And therefore that then determines, well, we need to do something about it. And can we balance them? Well, we can help balance them, and we can also, through feedback from them, help determine what factors are causing stress, creating acidity, causing excess oxidation and other processes that are having an impact on our pH system. In other words, having an impact on factors associated with the health of our internal environment. And if we can help balance these aspects and get the systems eliminating and clearing and cleansing, then yes, we can have an influence on on balancing them and getting them back into their healthy stages, even just by doing our energy work. But of course, at the same time, if we can encourage the person to, acquire maybe more healthy habits as a normal, as part of self-responsibility, that would be even more wonderful. So, so certainly, I think there are things we can do that to help to work with these things. Certainly, I mean, microbiomes in the same aspect. At least we can recognise and balance our gut out, and look to get it into a balanced state that allows an environment for the microbiomes in our gut to not be overgrown or overstimulated, or to exist in a healthy state. And ultimately it may mean, yes, having probiotics to boost and help this, digestive system. But clearly, it's much better to have means to be able to monitor and test and work with these things to firstly, help balance systems, to help them get back into their symbiotic stages, but also, as indicators for people to, get back to a good, healthy nutritional basis, good water, good air, good, the things that we spoke about, good exercise. And this area and work has been ratified. There are some naturopathic clinics that do, test people's blood and look at the types of organism in it with dark field microscopes, and they set them a path to take to help work towards cleaning up their internal environment. And then they go back 3 or 4 or however many months later and observe their blood. Mm-hmm. And they find that, the blood, these different forms, the pathogenic stages, have disappeared. And the blood becomes clean and healthy, and there is evidence of the first 3 stages, but not the fungi or molds or yeasts that are associated with cancer. And clearly, that's another subject when ultimately they've associated cancer with stages that are, acid and oxidized, lacking oxygen, and are polluted. And these are factors of our parts of our body or internal environment that essentially are promoting abnormal cells to flourish. So again, if we want to work with that in a more whole body sense, then that can be very effective also. And in fact, that is the direction that Gaston Neeson's and another gentleman called George Merkel, their main approach to their kind of medicine was to actually help the person boost their immune system. So they developed very simple products and cheap products that would achieve that, and ultimately that, in conjunction with healthy nutrition, etc., these people made amazing sort of recoveries. So, and that is, so ultimately they're looking to get the body back into balance, get the immune system back into balance, for it to do what it's meant to do day in, day out. And that's the key or the secret to it, of understanding that. So, it comes back to all the basic fundamentals of a, happy, healthy lifestyle, and, releasing stress out of these systems to allow them to function normally. And that's what I hope that we can achieve by having access working with somatids and microbiomes, and also, particularly this fluid environment in our body, which again is another area that's been neglected by science, which is commonly known as the extracellular matrix, and it is another area of great interest. In a sense, it's the largest organ in our body, and it helps clear, if you like, the oceans in our body of toxins and acidity and so on. So anyway, it's a very big subject and a fascinating one. It gets to the heart of biology.
I was really excited because I started watching my older kids. They homeschool, right? And we watch these videos called Crash Course, which are designed for a high school and maybe beginner college little courses. They're little 10-minute videos on YouTube. Mm-hmm. And we were doing some anatomy physiology.
Yes.
And they're quick videos, but they're actually talking about things like ground substance and glial cells. And I was going, when I studied anatomy 15 years ago, these things weren't really in anatomy books. They were just sort of like, oh yeah, and there's this other stuff in there, but it doesn't really do anything. We don't really know what it is. Glial cells are just this other stuff that's around neurons, and the extracellular matrix is just sort of the goo that gives you shape. And
just holds us together. Yeah, it does. Yeah.
And it's quite interesting to see that these anatomy courses are starting to take more notice of some of these fluids and things that have been kind of neglected up till now. It's good. Okay, so last thing before we wrap up here then, if people wanted to do a little more research on this subject, you were mentioning that there isn't a lot of literature on Gaston Nissen or Antone Beauchamp because a lot of it wasn't published at the time. Other than getting themselves into a SIPS bio class, which I would highly recommend to anyone qualified to do so, what else? What can people look up, or where should they go? What book would you suggest?
There's a very good website called Euro-American Health that covers this subject very well, and it was actually created, I think, or at least that area, this material and information was put together by Dr. Dennis Myers, and he was a physician in a hospital for 30 years and was frustrated with the system and the results, and ultimately learnt and understood about these little things in our body, the little crystals, and so he put together quite a lovely sort of a text on this subject, and he's so that you can look that up, and that gives you a terrific overview and an understanding of it. And I think he passed away, unfortunately, but the champion of this, I think in the America now, is Dr. Robert Young, and people might know him because he's the alkaline guy. Which is a factor, because basically one of the main factors in the stimulation of these somatids to their pathogenic stages is body pH. And we tend to be too acidic in our lifestyle, foods and habits, and stress, and so on. And that's why it's, he's happily sort of putting forward that it's important for us to attempt to become more alkaline, and in that sense to be more balanced for our somatids. But yeah, they can get onto that, Euro-American Health. And there's another one that is called Biomedx, Biomedx, I think it is. That also gives people also lovely insight into this subject. But yeah, there's a few YouTube videos If they get onto YouTube and look up pleomorphism or gaston-Nielsen's, there are a few videos, but you know, it's only a handful. There are not many, but at least it gives people an insight into this subject, because yeah, it's not readily or hasn't been readily published in any book that I know of, particularly at least that I could access. So I wish them well with that. It opens up a whole new world to them.
All right.
For sure. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
All good. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you so much. So
I hope that's, yeah. Mm-hmm.
that's a lot of food for thought for everyone. So there'll be sort of a summarized version of this in the magazine, and then this will all be available on YouTube for people to explore. So thanks, Ian.
Well, I'd love people to be stimulated and enough to want to start getting their head into this, because it is fascinating, and it just changes your view of biology completely. And you know, for us to contemplate that the cell is not the basic unit of life, is something pretty dramatic for all of us to try and comprehend, and to be introduced to these tiny little particles and the fact that they can change. It is mind-boggling, and it is challenging in that sense. And I hope that people are open to, you know, the results of these people's lifetimes research, and also, you know, the fact that this has been knowledge it's not just new information. This has been researched since Beauchamp's time, and really is 150 years old, but is really new to biology, or should be. Okay. So thank you very much. I hope people have gleaned a bit of insight from our chat.
Thank you.